Bestsellers unveiled at NK News Shop. Step out in style with our top-selling apparel from the NK News Shop. Fly high with the Air Cordial T-shirt, celebrating DPRK's golden era of aviation in vintage airline chic. Explore the stars with our Nada hoodie, inspired by North Korea's answer to NASA. Or toast to tradition with our Taedonggang beer T-shirt, capturing the essence of North Korea's renowned brew. Each design is a conversation starter. Find yours at shop.nknews.org. Again, that's shop.nknews.org. Hello, podcast listeners, and welcome to the NK News Podcast. I'm your host, Jacco Zwetsloot, and today we are recording on Thursday, the 22nd of August, 2024. Joining me on the line via StreamYard is Decker Eveleth, who is an associate research analyst at the CNA Corporation, a Washington-based nonprofit research and analysis organization, and he studies North Korean and Chinese nuclear force structures utilizing mixed methods, including satellite imagery. You'll find him on Twitter at DEX_EVE. And we're going to talk today about North Korea's missile system. So welcome on the show, Decker.
Thank you for having me. We're excited to be here.
I think it's fair to say that lately lay people have stopped paying much attention to North Korea's missile development and testing and production. Too many tests make too little impact, I guess. And if there's one thing that you want people to take away from this interview about North Korean missiles, what would that be?
Yeah, it's absolutely true that North Korean missiles have become more normalized. I would emphasize that North Korea is not at the stage where it's necessarily developing an experimental capability. Now we're at the stage where they have a fully functioning and deployed nuclear missile arsenal that is capable of targeting not only the United States, but South Korea, Japan, and other places in Asia. And this is a problem that is now a real deployed problem. And it's a security problem not only for the United States, but for Asia and really the globe.
Now, you're working with a lot of open source satellite imagery. And I'm just wondering, what's the benefit of working on very specialized military intel in open source? Who does that help if we assume that the military already has better knowledge on all the stuff that we cover and write about in open source intelligence?
So there are a couple of important aspects here. The first is simply the public knowledge problem. The United States and South Korea and Japan definitely already collect a lot of this data. Problem is they cannot share it openly for a variety of reasons. That may reveal technology you don't want to reveal, that may reveal source you don't want to reveal, and so they can't actually share this information publicly. So what people like me do that helps the entire conversation is that we can say and find things and publish them, and that allows the United States to share certain data with partners, and it allows the United States to say certain things they would not have been able to say before. So that's really one thing of sort of getting around the classification error. The other way is that we simply provide more analysis and we simply provide maybe angles, or we look into things that the United States government either doesn't really have the time to do themselves or doesn't really emphasize. And so looking at very, very specific things down in the weeds of like specific, very small aspects of what the missiles look like, what their capabilities are, what their production facilities look like, and that sort of thing. That also really helps the broader analysis.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. Now, you work for CNA, which was once known by the full name Center for Naval Analyses, and it's federally funded. To what extent is it independent?
It's fully independent. We're an independent, nonprofit. We have a relationship with the government that allows us to do certain things that other companies can't do, and we are basically directly helping the Navy usually answer certain questions and certain problems by providing our expertise and providing our data and providing our help to understanding specific challenges that the Navy will encounter or the United States will encounter, right? So I work on the countering threats and challenges team, and we do a lot of that for basically all over the globe, helping the United States Navy plan and understand what challenges are upcoming.
Okay, thank you. Now, on August the 12th, NK Pro published a long analytical piece by you called How North Korea's Tactical Missile Deployment Aggravates Risks of Nuclear Use. And then the subtitle there, Hwasong 11D launches may support posture of responding to even minor conflict with mass salvos to overwhelm rock defense. And I encourage all of our listeners to go on to NK Pro if they have a subscription and read that article. But we're talking about mainly the Hwasong line of missiles, and they, based on
Mhm.
my preliminary reading, that we start way back in the 1980s with the Hwasong 5 and 6, which were at that time often called Scud missiles in the early days. And now we have a lot of very different Hwasong missiles, all the way up to the solid fuel ICBM Hwasong 18 that was tested last year. So in this article, we're focusing on Hwasong 11, of which there are several variants. And before
Mhm.
we get into those variants, can you sort of tell us, where does Hwasong 11 fit into the pantheon of all the Hwasong missiles?
Right. So the 11 series encompasses a lot of different small tactical systems. They have a missile that looks like a Russian Iskander, a sort of large SRBM. They have missiles that are smaller than that, and so that's a sort of suite of missiles for, you're talking about hitting targets that are 200 kilometers out, 400 kilometers out, 500 kilometers out, but not the really big systems for targeting things like places in Japan or the United States. So if you think about how we sort of categorize missile systems, you've got the ICBMs, the intercontinental range ballistic missiles, like the Hwasong 15, 17, 18. And then you have the sort of intermediate rung of forces, things that can hit Japan or other targets in Asia. And then you have the lowest rung, of which the 11 sits in, of you are talking about a very, very small, very mobile missile capable of doing tactical
Mm.
targeting at specific sites of South Korea. What we have seen is that North Korea is replacing some of the sites they have used to host the medium range missiles, like the Scud missile, and replacing those missiles with the 11Ds.
Okay, and that's the one that you're focusing on. Okay, so I understand there's a number of these variants of the Hwasong 11 series, at least four that I could find. So
Mhm.
there's the Hwasong 11A, or 11Ga, as it's called in Korean. Is that sort of the base model?
I wouldn't call any of them a base model,
Okay.
because I think that they're using the 11 umbrella to talk about more of a role and not necessarily
Right.
a base model.
Ah,
Maybe they share some sort of common guidance components or other things,
yeah.
but you're talking about, I mean, the 11D is a much, much smaller missile than the 11A.
Hmm.
I think that the designation 11, the things they have in common are they are all solid fuel, right?
Right. All
So they can
solid.
be
Okay,
launched
that's
very,
important.
very quickly.
Hmm.
They may share some guidance components, we don't know,
Right.
but they encompass sort of a certain rung of North Korea's arsenal.
Okay. Yeah, and so the Hwasong 11C, that's a larger one, which apparently is claimed to have a 2.5-ton warhead. There's also one that's underwater launched. It's the Hwasong 11S, and then there's the one that we're focusing on today, the Hwasong 11D. Now, recently, North Korea made a big deal about deploying 250 Hwasong 11D launches to frontline units, and we've talked about that on an earlier episode of this podcast. Why is this a big deal?
So previously, North Korea deployed a number of liquid fueled systems. And liquid fueled systems are very efficient. You can get high range with them. The problem is they're very, very large and they're very, very heavy. And so you have to dedicate a lot of resources to each liquid fueled system. When you switch to a solid fueled system, which is basically, instead of having a liquid fuel and a liquid oxidizer, you basically bind both your fuel and oxidizer together in some sort of acrylic usually. That allows you to launch a system very, very quickly. And you can have lots of systems that are lighter and more mobile ready to launch. So, what we have seen is that North Korea has invested heavily in developing and deploying these small solid fueled systems to quote frontline units in place of those larger liquid fueled systems. Why that matters is that it gives North Korea a tremendous throw weight. Instead of focusing on and saying you have maybe 200 liquid fueled systems, as in missiles, now you can deploy and have at a moment's notice thousands of missiles, right?
Mm.
Missiles that are capable of targeting, you have the flexibility to target things as small as South Korean tactical artillery units, all the way up to strategic targets with nuclear warheads. So it's a massive fire advantage and it's a flexibility advantage.
Now, the 11D, it's a smaller and has a reduced range. Why is this not a downgrade from existing missile systems?
So you are sacrificing some amount of range that can be supplemented with other systems, and you are replacing that capability, or not really replacing, but moving that capability to a system that is much, much faster, right? The big problem that North Korea has is that it's not a very big country. It's very small, and that means that you have a tremendous problem getting your military to survive the first 28 to 48 hours of conflict. And
Ah,
the problem with liquid fuel systems is that generally they have a very long prep time. You have to prep the missile for launch, you have to fuel it, you have to tell where to go, and that could take, an hour or two. And while it's doing that, it has drifted out to an open area and has lifted the missile into a firing position where it's kind of obvious.
hmm
The advantage with a solid fuel system is you don't do any of that. For example, the 11D doesn't actually launch at a horizontal angle. It launches at a sort of 45-degree angle. So it's a much smaller target. It's not as visible. It's quicker. And so if
right,
there's a conflict and you have, say, US and South Korean F-15s flying around trying to find
yep,
missile systems, it's harder to do. And there's a lot of them.
right. And these launchers that we've seen 250 of deployed recently, they can, it's basically a big truck driving around with four of these missiles on the back, and it can fire four of them in quick succession, right?
Yep. Yeah. Absolutely. We have seen them. We have seen Kim Jong Un go to the factories over the past 6 months and show off the launchers. This wasn't really a necessarily surprise. I think the surprise is how quickly they have built so many of them. The scale is really the surprise here. And those missiles are capable of firing pretty big salvos very, very quickly in a way that can engage and overwhelm missile defense systems.
Right. Okay. Now that is clearly an important challenge, a big threat to. So tell us a little bit more about overwhelming missile defense systems.
So South Korea has a broad military strategy for deterring and defeating North Korea at the strategic level. And one of the important rungs of that strategy is ensuring that South Korea has the missile defense capabilities to defend critical sites. This could be major South Korean military bases. This could be South Korean political leadership, military leadership, or it could be the missile bases that South Korea will use to strike back at North Korea, right?
Hmm.
And so you have this problem, or you had a problem back in the 2000 early 2010s, in which North Korea had this big arsenal of liquid fuel missiles, and South Korea didn't have a strong way to defeat ballistic missiles, and so it invested very, very heavily in producing that capability. Now the problem is that you have gotten yourself into something like an arms race, in which now North Korea says, well, now we're less confident in our ability to degrade South Korean military forces. So we need more missiles. And so you shift to solid fuel, you shift to having a lot of small missiles on standby,
Yeah.
and you likely are planning to engage large salvos of those missiles to overwhelm and defeat missile defenses. And we have seen them practicing this. We have seen them repeatedly go out, get 5, 10, 18 of these missile launchers. We saw them do this with the KN-25, a different assault
Yeah.
system. And Kim Jong Un explicitly stated that they were going to do this as a practice salvo launch for defeating South Korean airfields. He's been very explicit about the role of this system.
So is this what we call massed firepower?
Yeah, yeah. You're talking about putting together these large companies and brigades of solid fuel systems,
Hmm.
and you do the calculation where you say, well, maybe I can't just confidently destroy the South Korean airfield with 5 or 10 missiles, but I can do it in 30, right? And so you mass enough firepower to destroy and defeat not only the strategic targets in South Korea, like airfields and missile bases, but also maybe the tactical targets, like the artillery bunkers and short range missiles that South Korea has. And you do this by just firing off as many missiles as possible.
Now, in your article, you point out some reasons why North Korea might not want to be too hasty to believe that its massed firepower of short-range missiles will overwhelm South Korea's defenses. I think you looked at Israel as an example. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so we did a big study at my my former employer, back when I worked at the Center for Nonproliferation Studies, did a big study on the Iranian strikes on Israel, in
Mm.
which Iran fired a lot of ballistic missiles at two air bases in Israel. And what we basically discovered was that they launched, reported in the press as over 100 ballistic missiles, and they basically did negligible damage. They hit a support building for an F-35 hangar. They didn't hit the F-35 itself, and that was like the most damage they managed to do. And that was, that damage mitigation was achieved by the fact that Israeli and American missile defense systems were very, very successful at intercepting Iranian missiles coming in over pretty standard trajectories, and you could basically negate the mission of the strike. And so, you know, South Korea has a big problem in that, North Korea has a big problem in that South Korean missile defense systems are pretty robust. And
Hmm.
now you have a problem in which, well, if you were to launch 100 ballistic missiles to do a mission similar to the mission that Iran attempted to employ against Israel, you may not accomplish that mission because even if you don't get all the missiles, you only need to intercept enough to ruin the mission and make sure the target that North Korea is trying to hit survives.
Ah. Now, the Hwasong-11D missiles, they are nuclear capable, so they could be fitted with small nuclear warheads. These are, I presume, tactical nuclear weapons. That's what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I was just wondering if you could game it out for me. What might Kim Jong-un be thinking about using tactical nuclear missiles against South Korea?
Right. So the North Koreans have revealed and shown us several times that they are producing tactical warheads for a variety of their smaller systems. And so they've talked about having nuclear cruise missiles, having nuclear short range missiles, having all these missiles that you can put basically a standard tactical warhead into. And the reason why you might want to do that is because if you've got a big target in South Korea and you want to destroy it, you could launch a large barrage of conventional systems at it. And what that would entail is you would need to ensure that, let's say, just purely theoretically, maybe 5, 10 missiles would need to get through to destroy or degrade those bases. The advantage of a nuclear system is that you only need one to get through, maybe two, but you don't need to think about, well, how many missiles at the conventional level would I need to hit all these bunkers? You don't need to worry about that. And so, what I think the appeal for the North Koreans is going to be, and I think this is pretty well informed by both what Kim Jong Un has said, what we have seen them developing, and just putting all that together, is that what you could definitely do is maybe launch a couple salvos at the conventional level to simply exhaust South Korean defenses, and then launch a second salvo with nuclear warheads to ensure that you can destroy these critical targets. Right? The major problem, more broadly, is that missile defense has proven itself to be very effective when you are
Mm.
prepared for the attack. And it's been proven effective also in Ukraine, in which we have seen the Ukrainians adapt so that their missile intercept rates go up over time. And
Ah.
you don't want that. And so, because of this sort of pattern of missile defense effectiveness and defense over time,
Yeah.
what you may want to do is, if you want to maximize the effectiveness of your strike, you need to strike quickly. And you do so in
Right.
a way that is overwhelming to the enemy. And that's really the problem I see with the developing security situation on the peninsula, is that
Mm.
you're closing off a lot of doors for off ramps for de-escalation, because the window for victory or defeat is closing, right? You're going to have a situation in which there's going to be a time in which, if the war lasts for more than X hours or days,
Hmm.
the likelihood of a North Korean success in that war begins to seriously decrease over time, right?
Right. And so this is why you write in your article that, ironically, the robustness of South Korea's missile defense systems might actually lower the threshold for North Korea using a nuclear weapon, right?
Yes, absolutely. I think that when we look at the set of problems that Kim Jong Un and the Korean People's Army Command has, we look at those options that they're looking at, and we look at what they have developed, and we look at how they talk about their tactical systems, you start to see the problem that they are faced with and how they think about overcoming that problem.
Mm.
Now, I'm not going to say that like we should like lower the number of interceptors or do anything to stop South Korea from engaging in more missile defense. I don't think that's achievable. I think that's a good idea. But I do think that we need to think seriously about this problem and this conundrum that the North Koreans are in, and think seriously about what they would be tempted to do in a serious crisis
Hmm.
if they seriously thought that they were in a window in which in 24 hours they were either going to be victorious or dead.
Mm.
And think about what sort of indicators we might see if North Korea were planning to employ that, and how do we make space for possible off ramps in that sort of conflict.
Now, on the matter of tactical or battlefield nukes in war, this is certainly something that has become more of an object of discussion in the last 10 years, but no country's actually used them yet in war. Russia hasn't yet, despite more than 2.5 years of special military operations in Ukraine and lots of threats about using nuclear weapons. And so what mitigates against Kim Jong-un using them in a fight against South Korea, and what might, let's start with that first, I guess.
You mean why might North Korea use them and Russia isn't, or something like
Yeah,
that?
okay, yeah. Let's change the question there. Why might North Korea become the first one to actually use tactical or battlefield nukes when everybody else has so far avoided it?
I think what you have to look at is the fact that for Russia, the conflict over Ukraine is not yet zero sum, right? As long as they continue to control escalation, and as long as we continue to control escalation, there is a vanishingly small likelihood that the conflict over Ukraine is going to end with Putin deposed or dead, right? The problem for North Korea, and specifically Kim Jong un, is the fact that there are vanishingly few conflicts where he is not dead
Mm.
at the end of a Korean major conflict. And so on the peninsula, we have a problem in which conflict is short term. And because of the US and South Korean deterrence strategy, which explicitly makes a core tenet of their deterrence strategy the death of Kim Jong un, he is faced with a problem in that he looks around and realizes that basically any large scale engagement is either going to end up with him dead or victorious, albeit, in a world of smoking ashes, but still victorious.
Hmm.
And that's the world that he lives in. And when you have that, portfolio of terrible choices to make, you're still going to take the choice that gives you the largest likelihood of surviving.
Gosh, now let's have a little aside discussion just on arming nuclear weapons. Do you have any idea how much fissile material would be required to make 1,000 tactical nuclear warheads to put atop these 1,000 Hwasong-11D missiles that can realistically be deployed in the 250 launch vehicles we saw?
So it's really, really difficult to make that assessment when we don't really understand what their precise design is in terms of what
Mm.
their warheads are actually designed, in what way they're put together, and also just the fact that we have very limited visibility into the North Korean fissile material production facility. The United States intelligence community was famously caught extremely off guard by North Korea's ability to basically create a clandestine enrichment hall at Yongbyon.
Yeah.
And there are other facilities around Pyongyang that are rumored to be covert production facilities. And so we have very little visibility into what that would look like. We have very little visibility into how much material they need for each individual bomb, and we have little visibility into the actual process of weaponization in North Korea. What I would say is that, as I sort of outlined, you don't really need to put nuclear warheads on all of them, right?
Sure.
You can have a force that is 75, maybe 50% conventional,
Hmm.
and the rest nuclear, and you can tailor your operations to accomplish the same mission.
Mm. Now, what do we know about how North Korea, the logistics of how North Korea would conduct nuclear arming of missiles. Perhaps you could compare to what we know about how it works in the US or China or Russia. So, for what kinds of missiles have nuclear warheads installed in them already, or are they stored separately from the missiles? And do we think that North Korea has any nuclear-equipped missiles deployed and ready for launch right now? What do we know about these things?
We know extremely little, is that unfortunately.
Ah.
One problem with looking at it is that many, I will say, of the North Korean missile bases engage in some pretty serious camouflage activities. And so they really, really attempt to deny the United States and South Korea and Japan the ability to have a clear view of what their operations look like. Now, they have been getting somewhat more confident, and we have seen things like launchers being left out more.
Mm-hmm.
But for things like, especially at the strategic force level of like the ICBMs, they keep all of that very close to the chest. And
How does it normally work in other countries then? Are the warheads normally stored separately of missiles?
so it really depends what your strategy is. For countries in which you are mainly engaging in second strike, like for example, what China at least used to be, and you want to have very tight control over warheads, you store them centrally. So China still has or used to have a central warhead storage facility, and they had logistics units that were tasked with if the Central Military Commission of the Chinese Communist Party gave the order, tasked with ferrying those warheads as quickly as possible to deployment locations, right? Because the underlying assumption of the Chinese arsenal was that a bolt from the blue US attack was extremely unlikely. I think that was a good assumption to make. You also have places that don't do that. So, for example, Pakistan. Pakistan's strategic force posture relies on using escalation to deny the Indian conventional army the ability to overrun Pakistani forces because Pakistan is conventionally weaker than India. And so you tailor your nuclear force posture and nuclear strategy to be as intentionally escalatory as possible and to be as fast as possible. And so in that case, what we do see is nuclear weapons igloos at the same location as the missile forces, right?
Right.
So it depends on what your strategy is, right? It depends on whether or not you actually have forces totally on alert all the time, like the United States does, or if you have a much more relaxed posture. It really depends. If we were to apply the political science methodology that we have used in the past to a country like North Korea, what the theory would predict, and this is based off the work of Vipin Nirmal. He has a great book on nuclear force postures. You should all go read. What the theory would predict is that North Korea would have nuclear warheads stored very, very close to the missile units or at the exact same place because you want to be as ready as possible.
Okay, so that would be in line with their nuclear doctrine and what you've talked about today in podcast about trying to overwhelm and then get in a nuclear strike if possible.
Yeah.
Do you have working at CNA? Do you have any inside scoop that suggests that Washington and Seoul are particularly worried about the threat of Hwasong 11D missiles with tactical nukes possibly deployed to frontline units now?
I mean, I have an inside scoop. I'm not that senior. I mean, I do think they're very worried about it. There was a news story today or yesterday, I think, about the United States updating its nuclear weapons employment guidance to better deal with threats from Russia, China, and North Korea. We have seen the South Koreans become very, very concerned about North Korean nukes in general and demanding more reassurance from the United States. And we have seen, some U.S. movement on strengthening deterrence in the region with the, movement of ballistic submarines to South Korea and that sort of thing. So I do think that Washington is very worried about this problem, and they're, modifying their deterrence strategy and employment guidance to deal with the problem. And I do think that the Hwasong 11D is a serious part of that problem, in that now, instead of having to simply deal with North Korean nukes at the strategic level, with, ICBMs and other missiles, but now we have to deal with it at the tactical level. You have to deal with a lot of missiles at the tactical level. And how do you deal with that? So yes, I think that they're very worried about it.
Now, if nuclear weapons and missiles are designed to be a deterrent rather than actual offensive weapons, is there really all that much to fear? I mean, surely nobody is suicidal enough to start a second Korean War, particularly, well, looking at how badly Russia is doing in Ukraine. Why is it so dangerous?
So, I mean, in order to deter, you need to have a credible capability to inflict damage, right? And so, very few countries have really adopted and taken to heart this idea that deterrence weapons are only for deterrence. I mean, you could argue that China sort of did in the 80s and 90s. Well, that's a hot topic. But in order to
Mm,
effectively deter, you need to have a credible force structure that can say to the opponent, "Hey, if you do this thing, you will lose more than I will lose," right?
hmm
You will not come out of this as the victorious party. And so I do think that the missiles for North Korea play that important deterrence role. And I think that it gives North Korea and Kim Jong un the confidence that they have the capability to perhaps survive a conflict. And so I do think that we have to worry about this problem of perhaps Kim Jong un feeling confident enough that isn't going to start a major conflict. I don't think that Kim Jong un is going to do that. But I think that he will maybe think that he can get away with a low level provocation without escalation. And the thing I worry about is him not getting away with it without escalation. One problem we have is that we in the United States obviously have a very strong hand in any crisis on the Korean Peninsula, but I think a lot of Americans sort of write out the fact that South Korea also has this very, very large missile arsenal. And that missile
mm,
arsenal is designed to both deter and to degrade the North Korean arsenal. That force structure is designed to deter and degrade those forces. And we also know that the last time that not the last time, but one of the major times that North Korea did provoke South Korea by sinking a South Korean Navy corvette, the United States had to step in and convince the South Korean president not to strike back, right?
oh, yeah.
And so what I really worry about is this world in which North Korea feels confident that they can get away with those sort of provocations for political gain,
Mm.
and South Korea engaging in their deterrence strategy and what they've said they're going to do and striking back in a way that makes the North Koreans panic, right?
Well, what options do South Korea and the US working together have to deal with this threat or to de-escalate?
I think the biggest part is going to be just being extremely clear with signaling, right? I do not think we should let a world develop in which the North Koreans are guessing what we're going to do, right? I think the big thing is making sure we have communication with North Korea and making sure that the North Koreans are fully aware so that they don't panic and think that the United States is going to launch an attack or anything like that. This is partly why I think that North Korea developing satellite reconnaissance capability is a good thing, right? Because that lets them see what normal US operating patterns look like. And that
Mm,
lets them have more visibility into what our forces do on a day to day basis. And that inherently lowers the risk that they're going to, panic about anything. So I think that's the
yeah.
big thing. I think we need to make sure that we have a very cohesive signaling plan in place so that we
hmm
have very clearly communicatable options to make sure the North Koreans don't panic.
Is it harder to communicate and signal these things clearly to North Korea since there really haven't been any discussions or dialogues since the middle of 2019?
I think so, yes. And I think that, North Korea is also very aware of the fact that the US political system results in, serious changes maybe every 4 years.
Yeah.
And they're very aware of the fact that the person they're talking to could be different in a year or
Mm,
two. And that also plays into their calculus and how they think about it. And so that's why I think, given the level of perhaps uncertainty that our own political system generates, we need to have very clear signaling options and communicate
mm,
those very effectively, although it's very difficult to communicate anything to North Koreans.
yeah.
We need to have that in place and also make sure that, as we have been doing with the deterrence guidelines, making sure that the United States and South Korea are on the same page about what we're doing,
hmm
why we're doing it, and all that signal, and making sure that we're very, very clear and decisive about signaling.
Now, based on your analysis of satellite photography, are we seeing signs of larger upgrades of North Korea's missile bases yet? Something perhaps like what China has done? Or is it does the geography of North Korea, North Korea, it's smaller, it's much more mountainous. Does that lead to a different approach?
Yeah, so their approach is very different than China's because China has a different view of escalation. China is very worried about and very focused on making sure that basically their personnel are happy, and so they care about morale a lot in peacetime, and so they
Hmm.
build these very big bases close to major cities. The North Koreans don't do that. They try and make sure that all of their bases are as hard to detect as possible, and so it's
Hmm.
very difficult to think about and sort of gauge and judge upgrades to North Korean field deployment sites. With this particular example of the location I found where they were taking out scuds and putting in the Hwasong 11Ds, there hasn't been a lot of major changes to the infrastructure. We have seen them take out things to support the older liquid fuel systems, but beyond that, not a lot. So it's very difficult to judge, partly because so much of their force posture is underground,
Hmm.
how they are modifying their bases to accommodate for these new missiles.
So are many of the missile bases themselves underground, or are they more likely to be in a remote mountain valley?
So usually what they do is they have their support facilities above ground, and then they have either deep tunnels for hiding missiles, or they'll have basically a drive-through tunnel. So you have basically a very large mound that you drive through. They're on both ends, and so that you can hide your missile systems, your mainstay missile systems, without the United States seeing it.
Right.
They're sort of spread out across a lot of remote areas in North Korea, areas away from population centers, and it's again very difficult to get a good grip on exactly what they're doing and what their daily operations look like.
Do we know whether North Korea's intercontinental ballistic missiles are actually deployed?
Roughly, there are a series of bases that are up north, close to the Chinese border,
Hmm.
that look a little different, although not that much different. And we, I think for good reason, have assessed that those are probably the places where the ICBMs are deployed, partly just because the tunnels are bigger. But again, they are very, very cagey about leaving launchers out. They're very, very cagey about showing any of their actual wartime deployment exercises or anything like that. But it used to be, or probably still is that North Korea would deploy their tactical systems or maybe smaller missiles close to the South Korean border, and then once you get up north, you get to the strategic forces, and that's based partly on declassified documents from the United States intelligence community, and what they've been saying publicly, and that sort of thing.
Coming back to what you were saying earlier about the importance of the United States and South Korea being clear in their messaging, why do you think North Korea doesn't deploy things openly and let us know, what's deployed and what's out there? Why is North Korea not so transparent in its signaling and messaging?
Because the more information you release, the better idea your adversaries have of where you're deploying things, what their maintenance cycles look like, whether or not missiles are likely to be operational or unoperational based on cycles of maintenance and operation. And that gives your adversary a lot of information that they can use to effectively target you. Right? So this is a balance that I think Russia and China have to strike repeatedly, where China actually releases a lot of data, but that's because they are not concerned about the United States striking their forces in peacetime, right?
Hmm.
So in
Yeah.
peacetime, the Chinese release a lot of data about what their forces look like actually on TV and propaganda and stuff like that. Because China's very big, and it's hard to get those sites. And then once the crisis starts, those are all go to outlying areas of China. But again, the problem is that North Korea is very, very small. The travel time for missiles, the travel time for jet aircraft is not that long.
Hmm.
Any information that they release about what their operations look like will potentially give the United States, South Korea, the cutting edge and the data they need to effectively degrade and destroy the forces that North Korea is trying to hide.
But also, that kind of information could have a deterrent effect in and of itself, couldn't it?
Yes, I think that they are trying to establish deterrence with their missile tests, right?
Mm. Ah.
Because that's a sort of now it's pretty unescalatory actually, because as we said before, that there isn't really a lot of attention going to the missile tests anymore.
Yeah.
And you can do them from sites we already know about, right? That's why
Yeah.
North Korea tests ICBMs from places like the International Airport, because it's just a place that we already
Yeah.
know about. And there, they don't really try to hide their operations. They have built a maintenance area for ballistic missiles at the airport, and that's you can look at it and you're like, yep, that's the maintenance area for ballistic missiles. They don't try to hide that because that's just a test site. They don't worry about that being an operation capability. So I think that's the way that North Korea is attempting to establish deterrence, is by showing you the capability
Hmm.
and showing you, combined with test launches and then the events that Kim Jong-un, for example, the unveiling of the 250 launchers, saying, hey, we have this capability, we've launched it before, you've seen us do it, here's how many launches we
Yeah.
have. They can't tell us where they are or what their operations like
Right.
look like, but they can establish deterrence pretty effectively, I think, by doing those two things.
Yeah. If you look at South Korea in satellite imagery, you can see large vehicle pools at military bases where hundreds of tanks and vehicles and other equipment are stored. Are there things
Mhm.
like this in North Korea, or are they really all hidden underground or under some type of camouflage or in tunnels?
It's mostly hidden. Some of the things like artillery units and anti-air units are easier to find, but for most of it, especially like armored units, that sort of thing, you're really looking at a series of tunnels and other defensive installations that are built to hide your system from both detection and attack.
And that also makes your job quite a challenging one, then, doesn't it, in analyzing this sort of
This is
photography?
true. North Korea is definitely the most difficult open source intelligence target probably on the planet because they're so
Yeah.
closed off. They don't have an outside internet at all. They don't publish a lot, and their forces are just hard to detect.
All right. Last question for you. Is there anything else that you're looking at these days in terms of North Korea from the sky that we haven't talked about today that's also important?
Well, I think the big thing that will sort of repeatedly prop its head up going forward is the fact that they're doing so much work modernizing their space launch capability. They're spending a lot of time and money
Hmm.
modernizing their space launch sites at Sohae, and we can see them doing that. They built a new test site. They've modernized their old launch site. They're building a lot of supporting infrastructure for that, and then they're also modernizing. And you can see this from space. You can see them modernizing facilities related to their space situational awareness for things like satellite control. And that's a
Mm.
actually a good example of how we can look and use open source to determine focus areas of foreign countries, is that we see them developing all this technology and developing all these facilities to have a constellation of space capabilities. And I think that's going to be a big problem going forward, in that in 10, 20 years, we're looking at a North Korea that, possibly with Russian assistance, although I hesitate to say anything concrete about that, is going to have their own constellation of satellites for communications, reconnaissance, imaging, which is going to give North Korea possibly a lot more options in terms of what it can see and how it communicates with their own force structure.
Wow. Okay. Gosh, that's certainly very serious things and kind of a grim note to finish up on. But again, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast today, Decker Eveleth.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
And our listeners can find you on Twitter at DEX_EVE. So thanks again and all the best. We'll have you on again sometime in the future, I hope.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Welcome to a new realm of insights into the Korean Peninsula. At Korea Risk Group, we delve deep into the complexities of North and South Korea, offering bespoke analyses that empower decision makers. Whether you're in government, business, or academia, our tailored solutions provide clarity in an opaque region. Let our team guide your strategy with data-driven insights and on-the-ground intelligence. Step into a world of informed decision-making and visit KoreaRiskGroup.com today. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our podcast episode for today. Our thanks go to Brian Betts and Alana Hill for facilitating this episode, and to our post-recording producer genius Gabby Magnuson, who cuts out all the extraneous noises, awkward silences, bodily functions, and fixes the audio levels. Thank you, and listen again next time.